glad that the introductions are out of the way, because now we can jump straight into the conversation, unlike the earlier chit chat we were having, which was being live streamed. Anyway, congratulations on the box set. I love the name, The Company Quartet. But let's begin with a technical question. Considering that these were written, it's basically 20 years of work that you've condensed into a little box now. It's quite impressive when you think of it that way. And these were written, with substantial spaces between them. If somebody were to ask you, a kid picking up the box set, after this conversation, what order they should follow, what would you recommend? Would you go by theme? Would you go by chronology? How would you suggest somebody read all the 4 books?
Oh, very definitely by chronology, and the order, as Deepak read it out, is the order I'd like people now to read the books in. The Anarchy is the story of the founding of the company in 1599, which was the year that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, that long ago, in Elizabethan Shakespearean London. And it follows the story through this extraordinary, incredibly unlikely story, how the company utilized Indian manpower and Indian capital to conquer India. I mean, it's a story that's completely incomprehensible in many ways today, and yet it's true. A small group of London merchants managed to exploit the divisions in India after the collapse of the Mughal Empire, and to set different factions against each other. And by sheer virtue of repaying loans on time, as a good business does, they managed to edge ahead of their rivals. And in the end, India, to its great cost, was controlled by a company out of a small office, 6 windows wide, in Leadenhall Street. Extraordinary moment in world history, and a great lesson today on the power of corporations, how we have to be as careful of hostile corporations as we do of hostile countries. The second volume, chronologically, overlaps slightly with that. It's the first one I wrote, but comes second in the chronological series. It's White Moguls, which takes us from 1795 to 1835. And that is the story of, it's a micro story. It's the story of James Achilles Kirkpatrick, one Scotsman who came to India, fell in love with Heronisa Begum, who was a beautiful Persian, ethnically Persian Hyderabadi, and who converted to Islam and became effectively a double agent working against the company. And the story the book really tells, the story of how behind the obvious story of this sort of colonial imposition of a corporation onto India, there were many more complicated cross currents, with Brits being strongly influenced by and adapting themselves to the India they came to. And a whole lot of, at this period, 1 in 3 company men in India was married to or was living with an Indian woman. So that's that story. The third story opens 5 years after White Moguls closes. It's 1839 to 42. And it's the story of the furthest extent, and in a sense, the most powerful moment of the company, but also the beginning of its downfall. And just as Aurangzeb's Mughal Empire reached its fullest extent just before its very quick collapse, after his conquest of the Deccan, something you've written so beautifully about in your book. So with the company, its furthest and most extraordinary moment of expansion was when it took over Afghanistan, marched through the Punjab, through the Bolan Pass, and marched into Afghanistan. And for 4 years, it looked like the company was actually going to take all the territory between the Khyber Pass and the Oxus. Of course, as we know, it didn't end up like that. It was a catastrophe. The client puppet ruler, Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk, who was the direct ancestor, bizarrely enough, of Hamid Karzai, who was the same guy the Brits put in, and so the Americans put in the next round, the one that we're just seeing the end game of now. Didn't get on with the Brits and didn't get on with his own people, and the whole thing ended up collapsing around him. And then famously in 1842, there was this catastrophic retreat from Kabul when an entire, we say British army, an entire East India Company army that was actually, of course, made up of soldiers born in Bihar and Eastern UP, was massacred in the winter passes between Kabul and Jalalabad. And at least according to legend, one man made it out alive, Dr. Bryden on his horse. The subject
there's a painting that depicts that, I think.
Exactly. One of the kind of most famous images of the whole British Empire. This the remains of an army, it's called, by Lady Butler. Now banished to a regimental museum in Somerset as part of the British sort of amnesia about empire. That is the story of how the company, in a sense, began to fall apart, because it was this, in many ways, that led on to the next story in the quartet, which is the story of the Great Uprising, what the Brits call the Indian Mutiny or the Sepoy Mutiny, what in India is called the First War of Independence. I refer to it by the hopefully neutral name of the Great Uprising, because that's what it was. It was 1857 was the largest anti-colonial uprising of any colonized country in the entire 19th century. And 100,000 of these India companies, own mercenary sepoys, turned their bayonets on their officers and marched to Delhi to put Bahadur Shah Zafar back on the throne. But Bahadur Shah Zafar by this stage was 82 and a mystic and a poet rather than a Che Guevara guerrilla leader, and was singularly ill-suited for the role thrust upon him of reviving the Mughal Empire and kicking the company out. And the whole thing ended in a catastrophe again, largely because of divisions on the Indian side, which the British were able to exploit. And in September 1858, an army marches down from Punjab, occupies the ridge, moves towards Kashmiri Gate, then finally enters the city in September. And there follows one of the great war crimes of British imperial history, the Massacre of Delhi, when every male over the age of 16 who doesn't manage to make the escape is bayoneted. A horrific event that oddly is largely forgotten in both India and Britain. People remember the far smaller Jallianwala Bagh massacre, while the massacre of, it's uncounted, but probably in the tens of thousands in 1858 in Delhi is largely lost to history. Quite possibly because so many of the people who recorded it were killed. I mean, died in this terrible catastrophe. And that book ends with the collapse of the company and its nationalization in 1858, bringing the whole story of the company to a close. And what happens after that is, in a sense, the more familiar story of the Raj, which begins in 1858 when the British government take over, and it becomes a crown colony. Queen Victoria becomes the Empress of India, and so far so familiar. All that Kipling, Curzon stuff that, in a sense, we know very well. But what I was trying to do with these books was, in a sense, illuminate the period that Indian historians know as the Twilight, which is a period which I've always been fascinated by, and it's one of the last areas in Indian history where a writer can really make a contribution because so little is written on. And for 20 years, I worked closely with a wonderful translator called Bruce Wannell, who very sadly died last year, was my closest friend and closest collaborator. And Bruce was a fluent reader of Indian Persian and had very good Urdu and Pashto and Hindi, and was able to read the Indianized Persian of the sources right the way through from the documents we found in the British Library, that's originally been in the Red Fort, which there are large numbers in the British Library at King's Cross. Stuff we found in the Indian National Archives, a lot of stuff from particularly the Indian accounts of the retreat from Kabul and so on that have never been translated before. Other places that proved very rich source of Persian language, Indian history, were Tonk in Rajasthan, a surprising place perhaps on the face of it. It's quite a dusty, flea-bitten place today, but it has one of the great libraries of 19th century India still there. And the Tonk Oriental Research Institute has a spectacular collection of Persian language documents, which Bruce went to and used for particularly the Anarchy. And finally, in Return of a King, a huge, surprising range of Afghan accounts of the retreat from Kabul and the First Anglo-Afghan War, because this, of course, was a great national moment. This is what, like Waterloo or the Battle of Britain for the British, or any of the great patriotic battles of Indian history. This is a major moment in national memory. So there are a surprising number of accounts from many different perspectives. And I think if this quartet has anything which is new and interesting and which will be remembered, I'm sure it is Bruce's translation of these rare sources, which have simply never been touched before. And as you know well, this is one of the kind of odd paradoxes of any early modern or modern Indian history is that so many of the sources are written in Persian, a language that no one in India speaks any longer or reads. And while there are a few academics who can read it, there are very few people that have really good mastery anymore over the subtleties and nuances and the linguistic variations that you find. And it's very, very different from modern Persian, as written and spoken in Tehran today. It's almost a completely different language. It's closer to the written language and spoken language of Kabul today, Dari, but different even from that. So in a sense, you have to be quite good at Urdu and Hindi as well as Dari to read it.
Yeah. I'm curious, you didn't mention Hyderabad.
So, and he, as I say, he died last year. So in a sense, my door to Narnia has been barred now. I can't go back through the wardrobe and discover that wonderful world quite with the same ease that I used to. But this quartet is completed now, so it's out there, and this is very much Bruce's memorial, and it's dedicated to him.
So does this mean you're not going back into company history again?
I'm not for the time being. I'm going to leave it for a bit. I mean, I may be back in 10 years or something.
So we need a fresh box set then, because one of the things I've noticed about all the books is you mentioned the company's career in India, rise and fall, but equally an important and a very prominent part of, I think, all three of the books, if not the fourth, is the Mughals. They're obviously present, but I always wondered, why it was that you hadn't written something about the company and the Marathas, because I think there is a book there. Because you have the height of the Marathas by the in the late 18th century, and you have the company which was also creeping up in the same period. And they clash in Orissa, they clash in Delhi, etc. There is a story to be told there. So perhaps do you have plans to come back to that at some point?
Story to be told there, and you're quite right that this is very. I mean, I live in Delhi, and partly for that reason, this book definitely has a very Delhi-centric feel. Which is something that you in your career, Manu, have managed to balance very nicely with your histories, looking from the Deccan and looking from Trivandrum. And I think one of the criticisms of a lot of Indian history, not just my work, but traditional Indian accounts, is that they do have this bias towards the north and towards Delhi. Someone who is working on the Marathas and writing a parallel set of books to mine with very different account, with a very different perspective and weight, is Uday Kulkarni, who is incredibly prolific, and every year seems to come up with another extraordinary book on Maratha history. So anyone who wants to learn more about the Marathas, Uday is a very, very good source to go to. Just like
he's got a new one coming
anyone
out soon,
wanting to know more about the Deccan history, to look at a book called Rebel Sultan, one of my favorite books.
To be fair, though, you have gone into a Mughal successor state in Hyderabad. In White Mughals, it really is about a successor state. It's not the Delhi Mughals. It's Mughal culture as it exists in the south. And that's the other big, interesting thing about all these four books. In one, you've got this large canvas which you're trying to populate and sort of, build a huge sort of story there, or tell a large story there. And then you've got something like White Mughals, which is very much, take a magnifying glass and go in deep into a family relationship. There's so much about marriage. It's about race. It's about the domestic setup. It's about gender to a certain extent. It's about this woman, how her kids go off, all of that. There's a very personal element there, just as you have this company machine kind of a thing in the Anarchy. And again, the trajectory mentioned again makes sense, because although you haven't written these books chronologically, you do see in the Anarchy there's a certain confusion. The company is rising, but it's also fighting with a bunch of other people. There's plenty of players there. You find in White Mughals, there's still the French influence. There's still a degree of uncertainty. As you said, by the time of the Afghanistan book, you see that the company is very secure. Now it's about geopolitics. It's about the big issues that matters to an empire. But with the last Mughal, you mentioned, of course, the destruction of Delhi, the massacre, etc. One of the things that I remember when I read the book for the first time, a point you made in it, which really has stayed with me since then, is about the legal basis of the trial of the emperor. The last emperor being tried by the East India Company. And you actually say that these people existed in India based on a document the emperor gave them. And they had no locus standi to actually come in and try the emperor. I thought that was just, no, I never thought of it that way.
It's a very good point. I have to say it's not a new point. This point has been made by historians for a century. And even at the time, there were some rare voices such as Karl Marx, who writing bizarrely in a New York paper who make this point. Because yes, the original firman, which granted the company access to India, was given by Farrukhsiyar, and then a whole subsequent list of different privileges that were awarded came out of the relationship with the Mughal Empire. And the company coins and the company seal, right up until 1832, had Fidvi Shah Alam, or Fidvi Shah, Akbar Shah, the vassal, the acknowledged vassal of the emperor. And it was only in 1832, just as Zafar's about to come to the throne, that that goes from the company seal and the company coins. And so they're quite open, absolutely explicitly, up until that point. The company is there as supposedly the loyal vassal protector of the Mughal realm. And so for the company to put the emperor on trial is a bizarre inversion of not just justice, but actual legal principle.
You actually see this throughout the encounter with India, because even in Hastings' time, the issue with Edmund Burke, etc., was very much on, I would say, legal principle and morality, but also legal principle. It was, they were all, I think, a bit confused about how far the company could go. You had the arms and you had the power, but there was always, I think, this hesitation somewhere within the system as well, that what they were doing, I would say that they were perhaps aware that what they were doing was not morally correct. And, you get that undertone throughout a lot of these transactions.
One of the big surprises writing the Anarchy was finding how much resistance there was to the company at home.
Yeah.
You kind of assumed that everyone was this was something that was generating massive wealth in Britain. It was the country's single largest employer, and you would have perhaps assumed that the Brits were shoulder to shoulder with the company. Far from it. The company was deeply unpopular for a variety of very good reasons. It was regarded as a ruthless, extortionist business. Liberals such as Horace Walpole compared it to the depredations of the Spanish in Peru. We have outdone them. They at least had the excuse of religion. We had only the excuse of profit. And so there is widespread acknowledgement, but also there's a deep hatred of these company nabobs returning in their mid-30s or early 40s with vast fortunes, buying up parliamentary seats and expensive properties, misbehaving, often very crude in their manners. And people across different classes and different political opinions hugely dislike these people. And there is a deep suspicion and acknowledgement that what they're up to in India is extremely murky. And this is published even in a lot of provincial papers. It isn't just the kind of liberal elite in London that are complaining about this. You find this in the Salisbury Journal, takes out an article about, is it true that Lady Clive has 5,000 pounds of diamonds in her ferret's necklace, and this sort of thing. And it's a very live issue, and which makes it all the more comical. It's very interesting publishing these books in both Britain and India. I mean, they go obviously all over the world. They're read in Australia and America too, but Britain and India are two very different audiences for very obvious reasons. And while Indians are very clear, quite rightly, that this was a looting operation operated by a bunch of pirates, and Indians have been clear about this for a long time.
For a long time, yeah.
In Britain, this is all quite new, and Brits are brought up to have the view in their history textbooks that Britain is this country that saw off slavery and the Nazis. So, in our own slightly warped self-vision, we are this liberal force fighting against racism throughout.
Yeah.
And what's nice about writing The Company and putting it out to a British audience is there is no pretense. It's very clear in The Company period. There's no talk of civilizing mission until perhaps at the very end with Bentinck. But even then, it's only the kind of thinnest of veneer. He's running a for-profit organization for the sake of the shareholder. And in the early days, it's absolutely frank. Clive and the 18th century figures are very, very clear that they're there to make a profit for shareholders. That's the job. It's a company, it's a corporation. Say with Goldman Sachs or McKinsey's or any of these big money-making corporations today exist for the purpose of making money. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and obviously it's what generates the world economy. But it is wrong if you're using it to exploit and plunder and loot, which is what the company was doing. And amazingly, to this day, the British are not taught this in school. So that when you meet a Brit newly arrived in India, he often has these sort of completely utopian ideas about
romantic,
Britain and India being this sort of happy friendship that finally ended up with us giving Edwina Mountbatten as a final wedding gift to Nehru. And so, in a sense, I'm fighting two different battles and addressing two very different audiences, a completely different set of misconceptions. For Indians, it's probably more surprising to read something like White Mughals and discover that a lot of Brits in the company dressed in Indian clothes, had Indian wives, enjoyed smoking a hookah, commissioned Indian painters to paint company school painting, and that whole baggage of tricks. For the Brits, the surprise is that Clive, whose statue to this day sits outside our Foreign Office and behind Downing Street, was a war criminal and a pirate.
I think you call him a sociopath somewhere. It's the other thing that I also noticed. I've got one more question about your own sort of evolution as you wrote all these books. You've basically been tackling the idea, the topic of colonialism over the last 20 years in different books. So obviously, there must have been surprises and revisions and so on of your own opinions. But before that, one of the other elements that perhaps you didn't consciously sort of string through all the books, but one thing that does sort of nag at me every now and then is the French presence as well, in the sense that so much of what the British did in India was also derived by all kinds of paranoias born of their rivalry with the French in Europe. And that sort of ends up having policy repercussions here, the growing armies in the 18th century. That conflict with the French, again, is not something we pay much attention to in our regular standard history textbooks, but it's sort of there simmering in the background. So one of the reasons I think you see that in the Anarchy as well, and also in White Mughals, is the French are this bogey in the background, and then the British often, either out of fear, irrational or irrational, they're constantly responding to something there, and that ends up having repercussions for India and Indians.
And the same is true in Return of a King with the Russians, because as soon as they got rid of the French, they begin fussing about the Russians. And the Russians is equally a kind of mythical bogeyman. The Russians are a very, very long way away. Even at their closest, they're at the Oxus, no nearer than modern Uzbekistan, which is, a long way from India. But the British worked themselves into a complete lather. There's going to be a Russian troops pouring down the Khyber Pass and throwing them out of India. And I think this is, it isn't geopolitically a real worry at all, but it is, I think, a real fear at the time. People do persuade themselves that this is an issue, or perhaps it's just that any militaristic empire needs an enemy. And we've only got to look at the recent vote in Congress this week, where America basically, for the first time in history, moved the entire budget behind defeating China. And it's the first time since the Cold War that you see the Republicans and the Democrats agreeing on something. It took the Russian Soviet threat in the 70s to make Democrats and Republicans unite and see eye to eye. Now China is doing the same with Republicans and Democrats. And I think you can draw a parallel with that in the East India Company. When they've got a bogeyman like the French or the Russians, they pull together and unite. And when that bogeyman disappears, there's a whole range of factional infighting.
It's quite remarkable, because there's so much clear anxiety there. The empire, I suppose they always presented themselves as a very orderly affair. But one thing that comes through all these books is that it was never orderly. It was often quite painful, often full of blunders. And, often I think there was no plan. It was just, these things happened, and then they had to sort of work around various things that happened. And you make this point in the Anarchy also about how the company director sometimes had no idea what was going on in India. The bosses in Calcutta had no idea what was happening in the field far away, in the Deccan or in Mysore or wherever. So there's this constant sense of tension, I think, which aggravates this need for an enemy. You always feel you're under siege, and that siege mentality results in this terrible, terrible thing called, colonial rule.
When you're researching the company, it's always important to be aware, in a sense, there are three levels of documentation. There are the provincial centers, and for the history I've been writing, mainly based in North India, the best archive for that is now in Lahore, rather picturesquely in Anarchy's tomb. And that contains all the documentation of the company from places like Ludhiana, where they're doing their spying operations, rather like Berlin in the 30s. Ludhiana is the center where the spy master, particularly Claude Way, is looking over the passes of the Russian. Then you have the level of documentation that generated by the company headquarters in Calcutta. And that documentation today is in Delhi, in the National Archives, or was in the National Archives until it got packaged up and as part of the Central Vista map. I don't know what historians are going to be doing over the next few years, whether they're going to be able to access any of this stuff, but that's a separate issue. And so anyway, that level of stuff is available in Delhi. Then you finally have the London Island, which is the British Library now. It used to be a separate office, but the India Office Library is now part of the British Library. And there you get the documentation of the head office in London. And all three are quite often talking completely cross purposes.
Yeah.
And the London office often operating a whole year or a year and a half behind what's happening on the ground in India. So by the time that a letter that is written by Wade in Ludhiana, by the time it reaches London as a reply, the whole war has been fought or lost, and half the cast are killed, and the letter that arrives back from London is totally irrelevant. Completely missed the point, and it's often in those gaps that you find the key to what's happening, particularly where local officers, often for reasons of self-enrichment, because if you conquer somewhere, you can plunder it. Literally, the rule is that if you take a city by the sword, this is not just a rule of the company, this is the rule in India too, that if you took a city by storm and the city resisted, you could plunder it. While if the city surrenders and submits, you can tax the people, but you can't do a wholesale rape and plunder, like, for example, happened in Tipu's capital in 1799, when every last bedstead and sword and dagger gets plundered by the company. So it's in the interest of the man on the ground, the officer in Ludhiana or in Mysore or in sitting in Bangalore or somewhere, to declare a war and fight a battle, while the directors in London, who are just looking at the profit margin and how much dividend they can pay to the stockholders, are urging caution throughout, and the London directors saying, no, we want a peaceable trade, This same letter gets written for hundreds of years while individuals on the ground are fighting illegal wars and shipping the goodies home.
I think hundreds of years is a good way to put it, because I do remember seeing a letter like this, or a statement about how these people were preoccupied with military ideas, where their bosses were saying no in the 17th century, and you have something similar with Lord Wellesley in the early 19th, and it's constantly the same pattern, as if there's no control. It's almost like the tail was wagging the dog at times. You see that the army in India sort of had a mind of its own and an agenda of its own, whereas the bosses in London were not effectively bosses very often.
And it's very easy to understand. If you are a soldier sitting in a frontier barracks, you want a bit of action. You don't want to play billiards for the whole of life. You want to make your name and get promoted, as well as get your hands on the gun. So of course, these guys are straining at the leash at every stage to have a fight.
And that's actually interesting, because a lot of the young men who came out and served the company, I think a lot of them at one point were Scots, and they often they were these younger sons of these middle-income sort of family, from the gentry, who had no prospects at home. The only way they could build prospects at home was by making money in India. So they had an incentive, I suppose, in a cultural sense also, to try and make a buck when they could, and then get back to their.
Very much the story of my family, and one of the reasons I've written this set of books is because it is my family story too. We are exactly the background you described, middling to low gentry in provincial Scotland, and it was never the elder sons sent out. The elder sons are kept at home to run the estates and to run the local businesses. It's the younger sons, but no use to them. Like myself, I'm a younger son. I would have been sent out, So I mean, my family are deeply complicit in this whole process, and throughout the company quartet, the Dalrymples pop up, maybe rather more than they should do. No out-and-out war criminals, and one or two quite nice ones, such as Alexander Dalrymple mapping the coast of the west coast of India, this sort of stuff. But it's in general not a pretty picture.
Wasn't there also a very tragic Dalrymple who went out and sort of died before he could make money or something? You told me a story once about
the Anarchy opens with Stair Dalrymple, who was the most incompetent East India Company officer in history. Came out, borrowed money, his ship sank, He got malaria, then died in the black hole.
Gosh. It's funny.
Leaving huge debt.
But, coming to your journey again, one of the things these books, a lot that comes alive is partly because clearly you've been to a lot of these places. I know, for example, when you were doing the Anarchy, you were in Pune, and you'd sort of gone out with Uday Kulkarni and seen places and so on. You've obviously been to Kabul and Afghanistan and so on. So the travel is, of course, a very important part of this. And you began, I think, as a travel writer, long before you started writing specifically on the Mughals and Indian history and the company. How much do you think that has sort of added insight to all these 4 books? And the other question, in a sort of related sense, is how much has your opinion sort of reversed itself, perhaps, considering that this wasn't written in the chronology of the events that happened, but sort of at different times? Do you now feel, for example, that something you wrote in White Mughals, you would revise it, now after so many years that you've done the Anarchy and something else has come to light, etc., etc.?
So the two very different questions there. The first one about visiting terrain. I think if you're doing the sort of history that's analyzing the accounts of the company, and it's a detailed economic analysis of the company's workings, or indeed anything like that, then there is no compulsion on you to go out and see places on the ground. But if you're writing the sort of book I'm writing, which is biographical and memoir and event-led, a narrative history, you cannot write it with any degree of authenticity without going to. Absolutely impossible. And there were various places where I thought I could get away with it, and for various reasons sort of ended up having to go somewhere. A good example is the Battle of Assaye, the Duke of Wellington's the young Duke of Wellington victory over Rutzman. Now, I knew it was very near Ajanta, and I'd spent a lot of time in Ajanta, many trips in and out of the caves. So I thought no point going to Assaye because I know that terrain well, and had this image of these plunging ravines and these river valleys and the green bottoms of the valleys with very stark hills above. Well, it turns out Assaye is only 10 miles from Ajanta, but it's as different a landscape as you can imagine. And I ended up going with the current Duke of Wellington. He got in touch when he was in India. And walked the battlefield, and found musket balls by the riverbank, left from the battle, which is very exciting. An old cannon lying in hedgerows and stuff. And it's completely flat. It's in a river plain with a very slight rise in one area. And all accounts of the battle talk about this hill. And I had in my head this rocky landscape, which could not be more different from the actual landscape. So if you're giving these accounts, you have to go to the place. And some of them have great difficulty in Return of a King, following the route of the retreat. I ended up having to go. I had a fan who was the chief secret police of Karzai, who'd liked Last Mogul, and he'd written to me. So I got in touch with him my first night in Kabul, and he fixed me up with a deserter from the Taliban who was the headman of the village of Jagdalik, which was right at the end of the march. I ended up going with this man, who's a fearsome warlord, who and one of the most exciting, but also probably one of the stupidest things I've ever done was taking this guy out into the field. But again, seeing that terrain yourself and walking those fields, and it gives a completely different perspective. What was the second question, Manu, you asked after that?
I hope to do a travel book based on these experiences at some point, because clearly there are stories to be told there. The other question was on colonialism, and whether you've changed or revised or reversed even any of your opinions in the course of doing these books, because White Mughals was in many ways your first detailed foray, but again it was a magnifying glass to a relatively small canvas. And then the Anarchy was this huge affair where you see the larger sort of machinery in work. And you realize that, did you realize that there was anything that you needed to correct or alter?
So White Mughals took 6 years to write. It was the longest of all. It's a very, very detailed and long research thing. And when I started it, I certainly had very different ideas to the ideas I have today. I was very interested in these White Mughal figures, and I suppose at some level hoped that there was a more benign story to tell about British colonialism. It wasn't all about war criminals and looters and plunderers. It very soon became clear that these guys were exceptions and that they were crushed by the company machine. The story of James and Khalid Kirkpatrick is of a dissenter who gets crushed by Lord Wellesley. And when it's discovered he's converted to Islam, they try and sack him. And it's only, I won't spoil the plot by saying what exactly what happens, but he's saved by the skin of his teeth by the fact he pulls off an enormous treaty, partly due to his love affair. He falls in love with the prime minister's niece, and that helps stitch the whole thing together. So any hopes I had that this would be a benign story and a different story from the Raj, it certainly turned out to be a different story in all sorts of ways, but it was by no means more benign. So I think by the time I actually came to write White Moguls, my opinions were pretty well what they were by the end of the Anarchy. And between writing White Moguls in 2002 and finishing the Anarchy in 2019, I don't think you'll find much political difference in my views. It's just maybe increasingly angry and sort of convinced of the criminality of the whole thing by the end. But it's basically I mean, I'm interested to see what, if anyone reads it through in the new order, in the chronological order, if they spot differences of emphasis, but I don't think, I'm not aware of them.
That'll be for someone else to study. You know, there are people who do PhD theses, etc., on books. So somebody might find something at some point.
I very much hoping you'll find time to review it. You'll be much the best person to do it at some stage. And what you've said so far has been so perceptive. So anyway, that's a distant hope.
No, I've actually, read these books in the order that they appeared. When I was actually growing up, I was in high school when I read White Moguls. And then over the last few years, I've read, and I've read the other books since. So I've sort of, gone sequentially as they appeared in the market. We'll take audience questions, but by the time they post dollars, and one last question, what are you working on now? You gave me a sense before we started live streaming this. So perhaps for the audience, you can give them a brief glimpse of what you're working on.
So I've gone back to an old interest of mine, which I've written a lot of magazine articles and periodical pieces about over the years, but I've never actually published much about it between hardcovers, other than odd essays in the Age of Kali and 9 Lives. And this is the whole magnificent story of early Indian civilization and the diffusion of it out into the rest of Asia and the world. I've always loved Gandharan and Kushan art. I've always loved the Ajanta caves. They've been writing about 20 or 30 years in Pallava. But this book brings it all together. And the idea, it's called The Golden Road. And it's the story of how between the time of Ashoka and the 11th century, India exported its civilization, its ideas, its cultures, its way of life, its languages, its numbers, and its science to an incredible great swathe of the world. Part one in this book is the story of Buddhism's journey north and eastwards through what's now Pakistan and Afghanistan, ancient Gandhara, into Central Asia, and then along to China. And it culminates, a lot of the book is revolving around a single year, 664. And what happens in part one is the Empress Wu Zetian, who's the only female emperor in Chinese history, converts China to an Indian religion, to Buddhism. And she does this for partly very practical reasons, that the Confucian system does not approve of women ruling. And that Buddhism, being more egalitarian, does not have the same strictures. So, and with Buddhism comes, like a Trojan horse, a whole band of Indian ideas about cosmology, about kalpas and yugas, and the ways of looking at the world, geography, and so anyway, that's part one. Part two is the whole, in a sense, Sheldon Pollock story of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, the story of how Sanskrit and Hindu culture spread from Kandahar, ancient Gandhara, to Singapore, ancient Singapura, two Sanskrit names thousands of miles apart. And this extraordinary story of how Sanskrit and Sanskrit literature, great epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and also ways of looking at the stars and studying mathematics and so on, spreads right through, even as far as the Philippines, right down through Burma, through Sri Lanka, through Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, And it culminates obviously in Cambodia, and I'm focusing in on the building of Angkor Wat, which is of course the largest Hindu temple in the world, but not in India, it's in Cambodia.
Yeah. And where the script, then, I think, resembles the South Indian Grantha script,
absolutely,
it's almost exact, yeah.
And Pallava Grantha is the ancestor of almost every South script in one way or another. But the Khmer script is particularly close. And the third part is the bit that I'm most spectacularly ill-equipped to write, being virtually innumerate and having failed every maths exam I've ever taken, is the story of how Indian mathematics and astronomy travel westwards. And the way it happens is very interesting. Again, 664, same year that Wuzetian comes to power, you get the Arabs in that great first expansion of Islam that gets as far as Karachi in the Indus on the coast. It gets as far as Balkh, the great city of Balkh in Afghanistan, to the north. And the hereditary pramukhs of Balkh, who run this center of learning called Naubahar, which is in many ways the Nalanda of Central Asia, convert to Islam. And one of their sons, who is currently at university in Srinagar, in Kashmir, is sent off as a hostage to Resafa, which is near the ISIS headquarters today in Syria. And there he meets Al-Mansur, who's the future caliph of the Abbasid, who leads the Abbasid revolution. And they together build Baghdad. And the pramukhs become the Barmakid in Arabic, who are the viziers of Abbasid Baghdad for 4 generations. And they bring the Sanskrit learning that they've been brought up with to Baghdad, which is how you get the beginnings of the Beit al-Hikmah, the great center, the great library of Baghdad, and why what the West knows as Arabic numbers, in fact, are Indian numbers brought from India at this time and adopted by the Barmakid intellectuals and then spreading throughout the Islamic world. And the final chapter is the story of how a young boy from Pisa is sent off to school in Algeria because his dad runs the customs house. And he is brought up and absorbs these what has now become Arabic mathematics, but is in origin entirely Indian, the work of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta and Paramahira and all these characters. And he goes back to Pisa and he takes this new numeral system to the court of Frederick II. And that man is Fibonacci, of the Fibonacci sequence, Leonardo Fibonacci. And that is how the numbers we all use today, which originated in India, are on the screens of the computer or the mobile you're watching this on at this moment. So and it's a story some people know some bits of, but it's kind of a story that lots of people don't know lots of other bits of. And if you see it all as one thing, which is this sort of vast diffusion of Indian ideas, it's something which I think Indians should be very proud of. And there is this vague idea that India had sort of space travel at the time of the Mahabharata, or plastic surgery, Ganesh, and all the rest of it. But the real story is so spectacular and so unknown, even to many Indians, many of these aspects and certainly the nuances, that you don't need to make it up. You don't need to chest beat crazily about internet at the time of the Ramayana or something. The real story of the brilliance of Brahmagupta's mathematics and his understanding of the curvature of the earth, the story of how the Mahabharata names from the Mahabharata crop up in Thailand and Java and Indonesia. Indian forms of architecture can be found as far away as Japan and China. These are extraordinary stories, and there's libraries. This is not new, any of it. But I think it's been brought together in one book. So that's what I'm working on and have systematically bitten off more than I can chew. It'll be a while.
Zooming further and further out, this is a trans-regional, transcontinental kind of affair. So it sounds very exciting. I'll take audience questions now. The first question is, it's actually, it makes sense. Of all the 4 books that you've written and which are part of this, which is your favorite work and which was the most challenging?
Oh, difficult question to answer. The one I got most obsessed about was White Mughals, and I kind of had to sell half my goods to finish that book. It took 6 years, bankrupted me. But it's also the one that's most flawed, I think, because it's too long. And and you asked whether I would rewrite anything. I wouldn't rewrite anything on political basis, but in a literary sense, I would take 100 pages out of White Movies if I had a chance. It's just too long and too detailed. I think you may have had a similar problem with the Ivory.
I do. I have the same feeling now that I would have taken chunks of it out if I had a chance. But yeah.
When one has a new baby and one discovers history and lives in the archives, there is a danger sometimes one can't see wood from trees. It puts everything in. But I suppose the two I'm most proud of, I think, are probably the first and the last chronologically: the Anarchy at the beginning and Last Mughal at the end.
Okay, another question. How were you first introduced to Indian history? I would imagine through your travels.
So I had originally wanted to be an archaeologist in the Middle East. I actually had no interest in Indian, although my family had been here for generations and I have Bengali blood. I knew nothing of this growing up, and there was nothing Indian, nothing obviously Indian in the house. I mean, some colonial families grew up with sort of, elephant's legs where people kept the umbrellas or something. There was none of that. It was all very Scottish. But my plans fell through. Saddam Hussein closed down the British School of Archaeology, where I was meant to be going, saying it was a nest of British spies. I missed my career in espionage at that point, clearly. And I ended up going with a friend to India at quite short notice and teaching Indian history in Dehradun, not the great Doon School, but a local school called St. Joseph's Academy, run by the Irish Christian Brothers. And I literally learned it with the school textbook on the flight from Heathrow. Was my first encounter with. I mean, I'd done bits of Indian history at school, and I'd always been interested in 1857 for a while. But really, I mean, the first time I heard some of the big names of ancient Indian history, definitely then.
All right. What are some of your favorite books for readers to beat anxiety during the pandemic? Well, you've got 4 here in a box, so perhaps that.
Throw in Rebel Sultans instantly. What would I recommend to? What have I? I mean, okay, we'll do some all-time favorite books. All-time favorite novel, among the great classics, War and Peace, Tolstoy. A boring answer because everyone says it, who's ever read it, but it is the greatest novel ever written, and anyone that loves history particularly must read that book. And the pandemic is the great opportunity to tackle a 1,000-page Russian novel. Short, funny, sort of contemporary novels. I love Truman Capote. If you want to relieve some anxiety in lockdown, pull out Breakfast at Tiffany's or Music for Chameleons or even Answered Prayers. They're very naughty, witty, funny. So a great living novelist. My favorite is Cormac McCarthy. Again, I wouldn't necessarily do it for beating anxiety because The Road is one of the most harrowing books ever written. But Blood Meridian, I think, is probably my favorite modern novel. Spectacular writer. Non-fiction, if you like the kind of thing I do, you should read the guy who, in a sense, has been my mentor and tutor in writing narrative history, who was the great historian of the Crusades, Sir Stephen Rutzman. 3 volumes, but particularly the First Crusade, the first of his 3 books, is now very old-fashioned and written in the 50s and 60s, but still a magnificent work of narrative history, and the way anything that I've learned about sketching characters and how to paint a novelistic picture of a person in a history book, but using facts and using primary sources and making nothing up, I've learned from Rutzman. Favorite Indian non-fiction for my generation, I'd say Ketu Mehta's Maximum City probably still sits there as a great book. Favorite writers today, people still, I love Janice Parrott's work. I love Amitav Ghosh's Glass Palace, I think is one of the great books of our time. And for younger historians, a certain Manu S. Pillai I'd recommend, Ira Mukoti, working interestingly on the French in India at the moment, and going to produce a very interesting book of exactly this missing area that Manu was talking about earlier.
All right. Next question is on whether you'll ever take up the fall of the Sikhs and their encounter with the company.
Well, you mentioned earlier, if I was to expand this company quartet at some point in the future, the Marathas is an area that is definitely undercovered in these books. Another area that's undercovered is Ranjit Singh and Sikhs. Yeah. And one of the reasons I think that no one in India has written a great book on the Sikhs so far is that most of the stuff is in Lahore. in the Anarchy archives, which I talked about, and I do have access to that, or certainly at the moment. I don't know when things are going to close off, but and so yes, there definitely could be a future book in the Sikhs, and I very much got that in mind. But really, it should be a Sikh writing it, I suspect. But anyway, but yeah, Marathas and the Sikhs are two areas. If ever this was going to expand from a quartet to a sextet, it would be Marathas and Ranjit Singh that would expand it, I think.
No, that'd be two very exciting books. All right, I don't see any more questions posted in our chat window. So I'll ask you one last one. There's this, with good reason, there's this whole, idea that history should not be reduced to great men. But even when you were talking about this Chinese empress, for example, and, you do see in different moments of this colonial encounter with India, sometimes these individuals do matter. It's just, you can't help but think that if it wasn't this particular person with this particular background here, would things have happened in a different way? Because I think, without overstating the case, clearly, I think some individuals do make a vast difference. Do you agree? Do you feel either way that these statements sort of need to be reconciled?
So yes, this is the great question. Tolstoy, of course, who we mentioned a minute ago, in War and Peace, very strongly makes the opposite case, that the great men are buffeted away in the winds of the chances of warfare or economic movements and so on, and that we are just puppets in the hands of the great puppeteer of history.
Yeah.
I'm with Manu. I don't believe that. I think that certain people do alter the course of history through their personality. To give an example, in contemporary India, whether you love him or hate him, would modern India be the place it is now without Narendra Modi? It seems to me very clearly that he's altered the course of Indian history at present, and that the utter defeat of the Congress party that we see at the moment, and the splintering of the opposition. Now, you may regard that as a catastrophe, or you may regard that as a great uprising and the return of India to greatness and so on. But that Narendra Modi has altered the state of things today. It seems to me unarguably the case. And I think the same is true of the 19th century. I think someone like Clive is a very good example. Yeah. What's odd about Clive is that he's an evil, ruthless man, but he has such chutzpah. He takes on odds that I would never dream of risking, and not just once, but over and over again.
And then kills himself.
All his greatest victories, whether in the Carnatic Wars in the 1740s, or when first fighting Siraj-ud-Dowlah outside Calcutta in the mist, invading a camp of an army 10 times his size at night in the mist. So many things could have gone wrong. Everyone should have warned him against that, and yet it had the effect he wanted. Again, at the Battle of Plassey, when 5,000 troops were surrounded by 100,000, and again, but for a rainstorm, could so easily have been defeated. And to Clive, that's those sort of figures who do take these incredible risks and alter the course of history do seem to me to be crucial characters to be discussed. And obviously, you've got to put against that changes in climate, changes in economic power. I just had dinner last night with Peter Frankopan here in Oxford, and Frankopan's next book is about how changes in climate have altered history. And there are these wider forces which are invisible, but which a historian can pick up on and see how they alter. But equally, it seems to me that the power of an individual, Babur, the chance that Babur took in 1526, Battle of Panipat, and many other men would not have done that. The fact that he did and then pushed on madly, I think seriously altered the trajectory of Indian history. And I would challenge anyone to deny that, for better or worse. Again, it may be someone you hate. You may regard Babur as an entirely malevolent force, but that his chutzpah changed Indian history seems to me, as with the case of Modi, to be unarguable.
And we haven't even discussed Gandhi yet. Again, another example of what one man can do.
Completely unlikely story that no one would have imagined in advance. Yet,